All right, if we get our masks on here again. A couple of announcements. The Career Services is going to have tonight at 7 p.m. in the Contact Center in the basement of Kendall. It's a panel of alumni who work at McKinsey, Accenture, and Boston Consulting Group. So they're going to talk about consulting, your ability to get jobs into the consulting arena. And anyway, so it may be something that you can connect. You know, it is the who you know theory of the labor market. So you could connect up with people that are alumni, and if they're working for McKinsey, then it might, or Accenture, these are big consulting firms. It might be useful to come to that. And again, it's at 7 o'clock in the basement of Kendall. And then Praxis, which is the ECON club for the college, they're having their first event on Thursday in the next room over, lane 124 at 7 o'clock. And it's going to be the failures of pandemic central planning. It's a talk by Dr. Philip Magnus of the American Institute for Economic Research. So anyway, two events, tonight in Kendall and tomorrow in lane 124. All right. I'm going to go ahead and just take roll today. Joe Bentley. There he is, okay. Let's see, Tom Britcher. Jaden Buzzard. Tyler. Teresa Enns. Andrew Giovanetti. Drew Godsall. Michael Hagestad. Is he not here yet? Okay. Kaisa. Jillian. Luke Keller. Rachel's here. Anthony Lamacchia. Okay. Caroline Lively. Caroline? Lindsay Mertz. Andrew Nell. Emma. Thomas Rogers. Let's see here. Michaela. Okay. Sarah Strauss. Samuel Swayze. Somewhere here. Parker Thayer. Let's see. Joe Wagner. Sarah Wagner. Kaylin Walker. Adam Wheeler. Mercedes. All right. Okay. Last time we were talking about externalities. And what are externalities are a case where there's either a benefit or cost that's not being picked up in the pricing system. And we talked about that you could have a Pigouvian tax, like a carbon tax, is one way to approach it. And so it's not an odd thing for a carbon tax to be proposed as something to deal with global warming. So probably you've noticed that the Biden administration is very concerned about global warming. So a carbon tax would be one approach to doing that. Just as an aside, notice that when we were talking about efficiency, we said that monopolies are generally going to be inefficient because they're going to produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, but the price or the marginal benefit is going to be greater than the marginal cost where they stop. But if you notice that if you had a monopoly, you have a demand curve, you have a marginal cost curve, and their marginal revenue curve was here. This was the optimum amount, right? Q star. But we noted that the monopolist was going to be producing here, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And we said there's a welfare loss, right? Because all the units between QM and Q star have a marginal benefit which is bigger than the marginal cost. But if there was a marginal externality, right? This would be the marginal social marginal cost, which would be equal to the marginal cost of the private plus the marginal external cost. Well, then what you'd want to be? You'd want to be here, right? And notice that the monopolist is moving you in the right direction, right? So it's possible that a monopoly would be more efficient than a private or a perfectly competitive market if you had an externality, just because it's going to end up with less being produced. And that's when you have a negative externality, what's the problem? You produce more than is the optimal. All right, well, that leads us to Ronald Coase's famous paper, The Problem of Social Cost, so Ronald Coase is famous for this discussion of externalities. And some of the points that he pointed out in this paper is, one is that externalities are reciprocal. And what do we mean by that? What we mean is that you don't really know who's creating the externality, right? If we had our example of the farmers out there, and the farmer is drying corn, okay, making all sorts of noise drying corn. And then there's a farm next to it, and so there's no externality. But then somebody comes along and builds a subdivision, right? And when they build the subdivision, then what does that do? That creates this externality because now the people in the subdivision have this noise. So who's creating the externality? Is it the people that have moved in the subdivision? Is that the reason that the externality is there? Or is it that the farmer is creating the externality? And so if he's pointing out that you wouldn't have the externality if the subdivision didn't show up, right? So who's actually creating the externality? The second thing is to think about is that it's really, and what he argues is this is really a property rights issue. It's a property rights issue in that who has the property right? That is, does the farmer have the right to dry their corn, or does the owner of the house have the right to quiet, right? And in Michigan, we actually have a statute called the Michigan Right to Farm Act. So the law is saying here's who has the property right. So it's a property rights issue, and we might not have thought about it that way, but Coase has pointed out that really that's what we're talking about. Do you have the right to clean air, or does the utility company have the right to create electricity, right? So the next thing is that once you're assigned the property right, once the government is assigned the property right, then what's going to happen is there going to be an incentive to trade, and if there's low transactions cost, and this is important, if there's low transactions cost, it's like Dr. Butters, right? Your chalk never dries out, right? Well, these things dry out, but I'm going with the Dr. Butters, right? if there are low transactions costs, and this is the important thing, if there's low transaction costs, then what will happen is the parties will bargain, and the right will go to the person who values it the most. We'll make that. The parties will bargain, and where does the right end up? The right's going to end up with who values it the most. Which, you know, if you just think about it, that makes sense. That is, let's think about again, the farmer in the subdivision. Okay, so let's just, and of course, thinking about this, what this means is that it doesn't matter who gets the property right. If you are the governmental agency, it doesn't matter who you assign the property right to from an efficiency standpoint. It's going to go to whoever values it the most. Okay, so let's just give you an example. Go back to the example of the farmer and the subdivision. So let's say we have the farmer and the subdivision. So you're the owner of a house that next to where the farmer's drying the corn. So what if it's worth $100 to the people in the subdivision? It's worth $100 to them to have quiet. And the farmer can install a device that will quiet what's going on for $50. Okay? So for the farmer, they can install a $50 a device that will eliminate the noise. So the value of the right to the farmer is that they don't have to put the device in, right? So that's $50. The value to the subdivision is the owner of the subdivision, or the people in the subdivision, is $100. So if there's low transactions costs, that is, if the property owners association, let's say there's a property owners association, they can go and talk to the farmer. What would they do? So suppose the farmer has the right. So we say, okay, Michigan Right to Farm Act, farmer's got the right to make noise. If the farmer has the right, what will happen? The property owners association or the subdivision people, what will they do? They'll pay the farmer, you know, something between, let's say they pay him $60. So they pay the farmer $60 in order to have them install the device. So they get the right, right? So they pay the farmer $60 to be quiet. That is, they get the right. And they value it the most, right? Because the value to the farmer is $50. It doesn't have to put the, put the device on. But the value to the subdivision owners, the people that live in the subdivision, is $100. So what's going to happen? They'll get their, if there's low transactions costs, right? That it's easy to bargain between the two. What will happen is the property owners association will go in and they'll say, hey, we'll give you $60 to not make any noise, right? And the farmer will say, fine. For the $50, they'll install the device. Now, suppose instead we have that the subdivision people own the right, right? So there's the right to be quiet. Right? So that the subdivision has the right. So if we assign it to the subdivision, well, what's going to happen? Then the farmer won't be able to buy the right away from the subdivision, right? Because it's only worth $50 to the farmer. And so the farmer won't be able to be involved and get that property right away. So the farmer won't buy the right. And so what's going to happen? It's going to stay with the subdivision, which is the party that values it the most. So that is an important point of the Coase theorem, is that if you have low transactions costs and there's an externality, I don't have to know who values the property the most when I set up it's really a property rights issue, and I'm the government. It doesn't matter who I give the property to, right? It'll go to the party that values it the most. Now notice that it does from a distribution of income. It makes a difference. If you're the farmer, you want to have the right, because then the subdivision people are going to have to pay you. If you're the subdivision people, you want to have the right because you don't want to have to pay the farmer. So it doesn't matter from a distribution point, but it doesn't matter from an efficiency standpoint. From an efficiency standpoint, Coase theorem's easy to do, and making the point that it is that's a property rights issue. So let's just give you another little example. Suppose you have the paper mill. So we have the idea of a paper mill, and the paper mill, and you have a fishery, right? So there's a lake next to the paper mill, and the paper mill is, when it's making paper, it discharges something into the lake, and whatever that thing it discharges into the lake kills the fish, right? So suppose that you have that the paper mill discharges into the lake, and it kills $100 of fish, okay? And instead, what they could do is they could install this pollution device, just like we had that the farmer could install a device to quiet the drying machine. They could install a device for $50 that would eliminate the pollution. Well, what happens if we assign the right to the mill? So the mill can go ahead and pollute, right? It can go ahead and discharge stuff into the lake. It's got its mill is right next to the next to the lake, and it's discharging into the lake. Well, what will happen if it kills $100 worth of fish? Then what's going to happen is the fishery. What will it do? It will buy the right, right? It will pay the mill not to pollute, right? Because it'll pay up to $100, and of course, who gets who ends up with the greater value depends on the bargaining power. But it will, the fishery association gets together and they go to the mill and they say, hey, we'll give you $60 in order to install this device. And so what will happen is that the fishery is going to end up with the right? So fishery gets the right because they value it more. Now, what happens if you give the right to the fishery? So if I give the right to the fishery, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to stay with the fishery. Because they're not going to buy the mill isn't going to pay the fishery the $100 in order to match what the fishery is losing. And so they'll just install the device that will keep the pollution from going into the lake. So it's going to stay with the fishery because they won't pay, the mill won't pay $100 to be able to pollute, because it's only saving $50 by having the right to pollute. So again, Coase points out that if you have a situation where you have low bargaining costs, that is, I can bargain with the other person, then you're going to get an efficient allocation of the resource, right? You're going to get an efficient allocation of the property right. Whoever values it the most will be able to obtain it. If you assign it to the person that values it the most, it'll stay with it. If you assign it to the person who doesn't value it the most, the other party will end up with it. So Coase points out that if you have a Pigouvian tax, you have to decide who's causing the externality, right? I mean, here I don't have to decide who's causing the externality. If I'm the Department of Environmental Quality or whatever, I just, give the assignment to this party, and then they can bargain, and it'll move to the right spot. But so if you have if you want to use a Pigouvian tax, what does that require? I have to know. I not only have to know the value of the marginal external cost. We said that was a problem last time, right? How do I determine what the marginal external cost is? But I have to know who is causing the externality. I have to make that decision. And so his point is that if you have low transactions costs, then just go ahead and assign the property right. You don't have to deal with this with a Pigouvian tax. Also, he notes that if you have a competitive firm, then it's possible, right? If you remember perfectly competitive firms, if you remember from 202, they make zero economic profit, right? They just make an accounting profit which is sufficient to pay for the resources. So if we have a competitive firm, well, if you have a competitive firm, then what do you have? You have a demand curve that looks like this, right? And you have an average total cost curve that looks like that. And you have a marginal cost curve that looks like that. Remember from ECON 202. So their price is equal to the average total cost, so total revenue is equal to total cost. So economic profit 0, but they'll stay in business, right? Because the economic profit does have an accounting profit. They're making, but it just says they're making what the opportunity costs of those resources were somewhere else. Now, suppose that we have a marginal external cost, and this marginal external cost is going to be here. Well, this will be the marginal. This is the marginal social cost, which is going to be equal to this marginal private cost. We'll call this P plus this marginal external cost. Okay? And so this is really our marginal private cost. Well, what's the problem here? The problem is they're going to produce this much, right? That's the QE, okay? They'll produce that much, and what's the problem is that all those units, right? All those units between where this is where the total marginal cost is equal to the price. We'll call that Q star. All those, this is our loss, is all those units between that have all this marginal external cost above the marginal benefit, right? Which is what the demand curve is. So what do we have? We have a welfare loss. We think back to what we were talking about before, and we'll just label this A, B, and C, right? So you have a welfare loss, which is that triangle ABC. It's not exactly a triangle, right, because it's curved a little bit, but you got the idea, right? But notice that what's going to happen is if I put the marginal external cost on there and I make them pay that tax, what's their profit going to be? Right? It's going to be negative. Right? So they're going to have to go out of business, right? Because they weren't making any economic profit to start with, and now you've added this marginal external cost tax to them, and so what will happen is they will go out of business. Right? Because the price that they're getting is going to be less than the average total cost, right? Once we could shift that average total cost up. But the point here being is that you're going to lose that firm's going to go out of business. Now, if you think about what happens when you have a firm what do you have? You have consumer plus producer surplus. Right? There's consumer plus producer surplus. And so if we think about what is the consumer surplus? It's the area from the demand curve down to where the price is, right? And the area of the producer surplus is above the marginal cost curve. And so if we think about what is the producer surplus and the consumer surplus, it's going to be, right, it's going to be, we'll call that, let's say, E. And so the producer plus consumer surplus, if we call that F, right, so the area below the demand curve and above the marginal cost curve was your producer and consumer surplus. So it's this thing right there. Now it's possible that the consumer plus producer surplus is greater than the welfare loss. Right? So if I impose a Pigouvian tax, it's possible that if you have firms that are perfectly competitive firms, then the economic profit becomes negative and they go away. But when they go away, what did you lose? You lost the difference between the price and the marginal cost, or the demand curve and the marginal cost. And so you're going to have a loss of that welfare or the consumer plus producer surplus. And it's possible that that could be greater than the welfare loss that you had from the negative externality. So, I mean, his point is that if you have if you try to use a Pigouvian tax, you could cause a total welfare loss by having a Pigouvian tax. Whereas if what I do is I have a bargaining, if I just allow the property right, then the two parties will come to an agreement. All right. Let's think a little bit about the just some comments on. Well, first of all, is that clear enough? Okay. Right. Yeah.
Just a quick clarification on the triangle there. Is that from? Is the welfare loss from trades that are happening that shouldn't be happening, basically? It's a loss because the resources would be better used elsewhere?
Well, it's because when you have an externality, what's going on is that the true marginal cost is bigger than the marginal benefit. And the marginal benefit is along the above the demand curve. The true marginal benefit is this, right? And so for all these points, if this is the true marginal social cost here, which includes the private plus the external part. So if the true marginal cost for these units this is the optimal amount, right, where the marginal social cost is just equal to the price. So all those units have a marginal external cost which is bigger than the price. And so that's the welfare loss from the externality. And his point simply is, but you also, when you're producing a good, you also have, if you remember back to 202, you got producer and consumer surplus. Okay? And if output goes to zero, because when I imposed the tax, I made them shut down, what happened? I lost that producer and consumer surplus. And it's possible that that loss is bigger than the loss that you would have had if you hadn't done anything, right? If you don't do anything, you're going to have a welfare loss from the externality. But if you impose a Pigouvian tax and it causes the firm to shut down, then you lost the producer and consumer surplus that you would have had if you hadn't done anything, okay? So again, think of the Senate Finance Committee trying to put together the marginal external cost and trying to put the, trying to put what the tax is going to be, right? And think of, are they thinking about all this, right? It's, again, you can come up with things that are theoretically correct, but then what happens when you actually implement them? And you have to then also see and observe, right? I mean, this is what Coase did. Coase just observed that if what happens when you impose this Pigouvian tax, you cause the firm to go away, you might lose more from the consumer and producer surplus than you were losing by having the externality in the first place. All right, just some comments that we might think about is that, notice that if you have an urban area, a couple things go on. One is that you're likely to have more externalities, right? Just think about if you have a if you have a some sort of noise pollution going on. If there's, you've got a let's say you located a manufacturing plant right in downtown Hillsdale. Well, it's not downtown Hillsdale. In downtown New York, okay? Well, then you're causing all sorts of noise and everything else, and there's lots and lots of people around, so there's going to be a big externality. Whereas if you located it in Hillsdale, there'd be an externality, but it wouldn't be as great, right? Because there's fewer people to have the externality imposed on them. So small towns, you have less times where your action is going to affect somebody else's, either a benefit to them or a cost to them, right? By the way, it turns out that the Kiefer House was just awarded a grant from the Michigan Strategic Fund, and the Kiefer House downtown, the old hotel that's been abandoned for. There was a flop house when we first got here, like when we get here, 1989, and now it's going to be into a boutique hotel, right? So what is that? Why would we say it makes sense to give this grant? What is that? It's because what you're doing is you're providing a Pigouvian subsidy, right? That the value of the properties around Kiefer House in downtown and everything, right? They'll go up. In fact, there's going to be like a $12 million investment in the Kiefer House. So in any event, that's a place where you have a Pigouvian subsidy. And, but anyway, that's just an aside. But the point being in that if you have an urbanized area, you're more likely to have more externalities. And you're more likely to have a high transactions cost. All right, because there's lots and lots of people you got to bargain with, all right? And you may not know the people, but if you live in Hillsdale, maybe you know everybody, right? You know everybody in your neighborhood, or you know your neighbors. And so the transactions costs might be much lower. Like we noted that if you're going to have a party, what do? You invite the neighbors, okay? If you don't know any of the neighbors, then it's hard to invite them, right? But and if you got 50 neighbors because you're living in that will be affected by the noise because you're living in an apartment in downtown New York City, Okay? That's different than if you're living in an apartment in Hillsdale where there's 2 or 3 different neighbors, right? So you can see that the transactions costs are more likely to be high in an urban area than they are in small towns. Notice also that even if you don't assign the property right, there's an incentive to bargain. Even if nobody really gets assigned the property right, there's an incentive to bargain. We may not know who's got the right to do this, whether the farmer's got the right to make the noise or you have the right to have a quiet house subdivision, okay? But there's an incentive for us to get together, right? The subdivision people, even though they don't know what the right is, right, they could come over and say, hey, you know what, we'll give you 60, we'll install the device for you, right? And so even though there's maybe no assigned right, still there's an incentive to bargain, and that's what Costa's pointed out. And there may be lots of situations in our day-to-day activities where people have just agreed to this is the way we're going to do it. Also, it may be that there's some just sort of common agreement that comes about. If we think back to let's think this way, common agreement, there's some sort of social norm, right? For example, how many people let's say you're going to mow your lawn on a Saturday morning, okay? And when you mow your lawn, right, and you have a lawnmower that's gasoline powered or whatever, it's not, it makes noise. So how many would think that it would be okay to mow the lawn at 6 o'clock in the morning on Saturday? How about 7 o'clock in the morning on Saturday? 8 o'clock? There's a couple that's saying 8 o'clock. How about 9 o'clock? Yeah, pretty clear. 9 o'clock's probably okay, right? So we have a social norm out there, and there may be cities, cities probably have some sort of noise ordinance or something like that, right? But the reality is the way we do it is really through through some sort of social norm. Notice also that if you have high transactions costs, you need to know who values it the most. The property right, excuse me. You have to need to know who values the property right the most. Because it's going to stay there, right? I need to know what the property, because if there's high transaction costs, I got to know who values it the most. Does the fishery value it the most, or does the paper mill value it the most? Because it ain't going to, if there's some transaction cost that doesn't allow them to do it. Now, there may be some places where you sort of know what it is. For example, if you're going on US 12 and somebody's coming up on Milnes Road, right? One of the little roads that cross US 12, okay? Well, who has the right to cross that, to make that intersection? Do the people on US 12 have the right, or do the people on Milnes Road have the right? Well, probably the value to the people going on US 12, we're going to assume, is greater than the value to the people on Milnes Road. And so what do you have? You have a stop sign there. So maybe it might be a situation where it's obvious that we know who it is, and it doesn't cause a problem. But it may be that the property rights are difficult to know. And so you got to, you have to have some, if you're assigning that property right. For example, the Michigan Right to Farm Act, the legislature must have have determined or must have decided that the farmers have, they value that right more than the other folks value the right to quiet or whatever they're going to do. All right. Notice then again we might have a right to pollute, and we said that one thing that we can do in terms of pollution is that a carbon tax might deal with a mechanism of dealing with pollution, right? We said that you could have a carbon tax if the externality is from the release of carbon. It is probably true that we're going to see it's possible that in the Biden administration, what you're going to see is a proposal to have a carbon tax. Because what's their concern? Their concern is that emitting carbon into the atmosphere causes global warming, and that creates all sorts of externalities, right? It makes it so that, fisheries, the water gets too hot, and so the, fish don't live, or there's a rise in the ocean water, and so people's houses get flooded, or it causes more extreme temperatures, and so therefore more wildfires in California or whatever, right? So we come up with a carbon tax is not an odd thing to propose if what you believe is that carbon being released in the atmosphere causes costs on other people that are not being picked up in the price system. Now, what you could do is you could have a right to pollute and then let people trade it about. And this is also going to be a proposal, probably. So you have your right to pollute and then let people trade it. So what we do is we say, okay, you can have so many emissions into the atmosphere, and if you don't use them up, you can sell them to somebody else that values them more. So to me, I might have it's really expensive for me to reduce my carbon going into the atmosphere. And for you, it's really cheap, okay? And because I've got this coal-fired power plant and you've got a nuclear-powered plant. And so what happens is you're not releasing any stuff out, and for me, I know it's really expensive. So what we could assign and say, okay, you guys, everybody can release so much carbon into the atmosphere, but then you can swap it around. So if I, with the nuclear-powered plant, don't value this ability to emit carbon to the atmosphere very much, I can go along and sell it to you who have the coal-fired power plant, right? So that makes economic sense. And so what that is called is a cap and trade. And we actually, again, we'll talk about this more next time, but we've had cap and trade on sulfur dioxide since 1990 in the United States, but that's known as cap and trade. That is, you cap how much emissions that you can send out there, but then you let people swap it around. Now, in order to do that, the government's got to know what's the efficient amount of emissions to have going out there. Like, what's the efficient amount of carbon emissions? And then we're going to say, okay, that's the cap, and then we're going to let people swap it around. And we're going to give out that right to emit on whatever basis that we do. We're going to give out that right to emit, and then let people swap that right. So how do we know what's the right amount of pollution to go out there? Well, if we sort of think about it, one way to think about this is to say, okay, what we're going to have is how much pollution abatement are we going to have? That is, I'm going to have to reduce my emissions, okay? But there's a cost to reducing the emissions. I'm going to have to put a scrubber on my, on my smokestack, or I'm going to have to maybe switch to natural gas or something like that. So there's a cost to reducing my emissions. And so let's say we go from this is going to be our abatement. If what we do is we say, okay, we're gonna have no abatements, right? Zero abatement. Everybody's gonna be able to just send stuff out into the atmosphere. I'm gonna have some sort of marginal social benefit, and what's gonna happen is as I start to increase the amount of abatement, that marginal social benefit is going to be going down. That is, if I've got lots of pollution out there, the marginal social benefit of abating, when there's lots of it, might be up here. But then as I get towards where you got 100% abatement, right? So there's no pollution going out there. Well, what ought to be happening is that marginal social benefit ought to be going down, right? So the marginal social benefit ought to be, going something like this. And so when we get to 100%, then obviously you can't abate anymore. But it makes sense that when, the atmosphere's got a lot of emissions into it, if I reduce it by a little bit, I'm still getting a pretty high marginal benefit. But let's say I've got 98% of abatement, right? There's just a tiny bit of sulfur dioxide going out into the atmosphere. If that's what's going on, then what's the marginal benefit of reducing it from 98% abatement to 99% abatement, right? It must be lower. But there's also a marginal social cost of abatement. That is, if you got zero abatement, then the marginal social cost is going to be zero. And probably what's going to happen is that marginal social cost is going to look like that. And this is the marginal social benefit of abatement, from zero abatement to 100%. So to get that last 2% of the emissions out there, it's probably much more expensive than if we got all sorts of pollution and then I'm just going to eliminate a little bit of it, right? So if I go from 0% abatement to 2% abatement, right, the marginal social cost of that might be small. I don't have to do very much to get that much abatement. But as I try to get that abatement up to 100%, then I'm going to have a higher and higher marginal social cost. And of course, what are you going to do? The optimal amount of abatement is going to be where the marginal social benefit of abating is equal to the marginal social cost of abatement. And that will tell us, okay, here's how much emissions could be out there, right? How much emissions are out there when I've got this proper amount of abatement, okay? There's going to be some emissions out there. So now that's going to help us determine what's the optimal amount of emissions, okay? I'm going to look at, okay, here's the amount of emissions that are out there right now. I can reduce that. As I go to reduce that, what's going to happen? Well, there's going to be a marginal social benefit to reducing the amount of emissions, okay? And there's going to be a marginal social cost to reducing the amount of emissions. I'm going to find out where those things intersect one another. That tells me here's how much we got to get rid of in terms of the total amount of pollution out there. And then whatever's left over, right, you can emit, okay? And so we'll assign the amount that you can emit to everybody, and then we'll let them swap it around. So what we'll do for next time is we will probably get through externalities we'll talk about the cap and trade, and we'll talk about offering a prize. Rather than not putting carbon into the atmosphere, what if we offer a prize to people to take the carbon out of the atmosphere? Might be a better way to do it. And then we'll start public goods. So go ahead and finish the chapter on externalities.